So as I'm writing sermons, editing services, publishing things on the website and in our emails, I've come to love and cherish that button on my computer up in the left-hand corner in Word that's called the undo button. Because at those times where I write something I don't like, or I have a graphic or a picture that just doesn't fit, I don't have to get all stressed out and figure I've messed up the whole thing. I just go up, click the button, boom. It's like it never happened in the first place. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have an undo button like that in life? As a matter of fact, last Sunday when we were in Dallas, I had an occasion where I wished I had one of those undo buttons. We decided we were going to go to church, and it's a privilege I don't have very often. It's just going to church and being a visitor and sitting with my wife. And in particular, I was very much looking forward to going to church on the Sunday after Easter, because every year it's the story of Doubting Thomas. And I get a lot of comfort out of Doubting Thomas because I can relate to Doubting Thomas. So I set out on a search to see where around Dallas we were going to go to church. So I went to the ELCA website and I put in 15-mile search around where we were and came up with 5 churches. So I then proceeded to go to the websites of each of these 5 churches. This is one of the reasons why we updated our website. It's very important to keep it up to date because people are looking for information like that. So after looking at each of the websites, I decided and chose the service at a church where they had 2 pastors and more than 1 church service. So I figured this was a larger church with a lot to offer. Well, I chose unwisely. So we go to church, and there we are. And even though the church had 2 pastors, they decide that they're going to continue some special sermon series that they were having during Lent. So even though we're now in the joy of the resurrection of Easter, we went back to the solemn focus of Lent. Not only did they do that, but the gospel lesson that I was so looking forward to hearing was nowhere to be found because they were doing this sermon series from Lent. But the real kicker was that even with the 2 pastors, neither one of them preached. They had this older gentleman from the congregation who had been struggling his whole life with polio come forward and offer a testimony instead of the sermon, which probably was very inspiring, but the problem was I couldn't hear and understand him. So that whole thing about faith comes by hearing and all that, I didn't get at all. So now I'm a little bit ticked off. So at least they had communion. So we had communion, and that was great, and we're sitting in the church after communion, and behind the altar there was this beautiful, beautiful transparent window. You could see into the yard behind the church, and in the yard there were these crosses, and then this beautiful tree in the center of the window. So it was just a moment of focus, a little bit of meditation. And as we're sitting there after communion, waiting for the service to end, this big hawk comes down into the tree. In the tree was a nest of little chicks. The hawk picks up one of the chicks and flies away and eats the chick. That's my image of the service. I wish I had an undo button. And I'm not sure if I'll ever go to church again when I'm away on vacation. It's not very healthy for me. My wife said, I don't think this is good for us going to church when we're away. How nice an undo button would have to overcome those consequences that are the result of an imperfect and sin-filled world. There are many times in my life where I have said things that I thought were funny, where I wish I had that undo button. How about relationships? Any of us wanted an undo button in some of our relationships? I could use a big red button on my dashboard that says undo for some of the driving decisions I make, especially backing up. I have a problem backing up sometimes. And sometimes there have been things that I've eaten or I drank where I could have used that undo button. And how about buyer's remorse? Have you ever had that? Wish you had an undo button on something that you purchased? Be pretty cool, pretty powerful. All of our readings today are all about God hitting the undo button in our lives. And especially with the gospel lesson with Peter, do we hear God hitting that undo button? The gospel lesson is the 3rd time that Jesus appears to the apostles. They're still struggling They're still not believing their eyes that Jesus is alive. They saw how terrible his death was. So every time he appears to them, it takes them a little bit of a while to accept it, to believe it. On this occasion, he comes to them again, and he reminds them that he is the God of all nature. He shows them after that long night, as we talked about with the children, where the fish were, to provide for them and their families and to feed them, and symbolically remind them of what he said when he told them they would become fishers of men. And then when it's over, after he eats with them, after they know and they're convinced it's him, after he shows them that the resurrection that we believe in has some substance and reality to it, he takes a painful moment and conversation with Peter to hit the undo button for him. 3 times he asks him, "Do you love me?" To the point that the text tells us Peter is hurt. But why? Because he's undoing the denials of Peter. The 3 times he said, "I don't know you, Lord," before Jesus went to the cross. It's a moment of love and grace to show how it's undone by that love and that resurrection that Christ brings to his people. In the first reading from Acts, we hear how Jesus hits the undo button on Paul, known as Saul. Saul, as a Pharisee, was one of the greatest persecutors of the early followers of Jesus. He not only imprisoned them, but helped to put some of them to death. Until that moment we heard about in our first reading, where Jesus appears to Paul on the road to Damascus. And from that moment forward, this greatest of all persecutors of the church becomes the greatest evangelist and missionary of the church, through whom we have many of the readings in the New Testament. In the reading from Revelation, we hear St. John have this image, this vision of what it's going to be like eternally in heaven when the effects of sin and death are undone for us. The feast of victory that we sing about every time we gather in the Easter celebration is what John is calling us to hear, calling us to see in this vision of eternity. And the song that we sang together so beautifully in the refrain reminds us of how our God undoes the sorrow and the sadness brought by sin. You turned my wailing into dancing. I will give you thanks forever. In 1993, a man named Paul Rivers was arrested for stealing $337 from an espresso shop. But because of this crime, which he committed in Washington State, he's now spending the rest of his life in jail. See, Washington State had a 3 strikes and you're out law. I guess they were tired of certain criminals, certain felons doing the same thing over and over again. And prior to this occasion where he stole such a little amount of money from a coffee shop, he had 3 other assault and robbery convictions. And so there he is, no more grace, no more opportunities, no more chances to undo the things that he's done in his life. That's the world we live in. That's the reality that surrounds us. Yet in the midst of it, the only place where we find the opportunity over and over again to hit the undo button is here, in these gifts of the church. At our next service at 11:30, 18 of our young people are going to receive for the first time their communion, the resurrected body and blood of Christ in the bread and wine. Over the last 10 weeks, we have been focusing together with their families on what it means for us as God's people to wade into the waters with Jesus, the waters of baptism, to sit at the feet of Jesus and eat with him on the shore, just like in the gospel lesson. And what we've learned is that just like that button's up in the left-hand corner of my computer that lets me redo things over and over again, here in this place, in these gifts, we have that undo button. The question for them and the question for us each day is, knowing we have that button, do we use it enough?